This is the skull of Phineas Gage, who, in the mid-1800s, was an American railroad construction foreman that survived an accident which a large iron rod was driven completely through his head, destroying part of his brain. That injury had effects on his personality and his behavior, changing the conversation about the brain and the mind at the time. It suggested that specific areas had specific responsibilities, including personality, and that damage to specific parts of the brain might induce specific behavioral and mental changes. And this was revolutionary at the time, and it really led to us changing our understanding of the brain and the way that it works. So today, we are going to take a look at the different parts of the brain. We're going to see how different structures have different functions and how that applies to the different behaviors and mental processes that we experience on a day-to-day basis. So let's go ahead and dive in learning about the brain. When the brain develops, it actually develops from the bottom up. And evolutionary psychologists believe that that is how the brain formed as well. Starting with the brain stem, it built layer upon layer to our higher level thinking that takes place on the outer areas of our brain. So we start today with the brain stem. The brain stem is the lowest part of the brain that is going to hold all of our major life functions. Things like heartbeat, breathing, reflexes, sleep-wake cycle, and so on. The first structure is the medulla, and the medulla is responsible for heart rate and breathing. Personally, I think of the word medusa when I think of medulla, which helps me to remember that when you get turned to stone, your heart stops as well as your breathing. The other structure in our brainstem is called the reticular formation or reticular activating system. And the reticular activating system is a network of neurons located in the brainstem that is going to regulate things like arousal, attention, and the sleep-wake cycle. On the back of our brain, which technically isn't part of the brainstem, but it's kind of its own structure all by itself, is the cerebellum. And the cerebellum is responsible for balance and coordination. It's where muscle memory is. So those implicit memories of how to do specific actions and behaviors, that is going to be coming from our cerebellum. As we progress up into the mid-region of our brain, we have a structure known as the limbic system. And now the limbic system houses a whole bunch of different brain parts like the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. And so this whole system is often referred to as being responsible for instincts and mood. It is sometimes referred to as the reptilian brain as well. The limbic system also houses our reward center, so dopamine is often released in this area. It can be used as a reinforcement or reward for different behaviors. As we move from the brainstem to the limbic system, we have a structure known as the thalamus. And the thalamus is the relay center of the brain. You can think of it as this sensory switchboard. It is going to take information up from our senses and then decide where that information needs to go in the brain. So if it's something you see, it will send it to the visual area. If it's something you hear, it will send it to the auditory area. It is the location of the brain that takes that information in and decides where it needs to go next. The hypothalamus is responsible for things like hunger and thirst. That is a good mnemonic to think of with the H and the TH of hypothalamus, hunger and thirst, and also other things like temperature and sexual behavior. It's also connected to a part of our endocrine system known as the pituitary gland. While not technically part of the brain, it is touching the brain. The pituitary gland is the master gland of our endocrine system. So that relationship we saw before between hormones and neurotransmitters, this is the bridge that keeps these two parts of our body in communication. The pituitary gland is going to take information it receives from the brain via the hypothalamus to control for the release of hormones throughout the rest of our body. So if the brain is releasing norepinephrine in an emergency, the pituitary gland can signal to our adrenal glands to release adrenaline into our bloodstream as well. Also in our limbic system, we have what's known as the hippocampus, which is responsible for memory. So if you can remember that hippos have a good memory on campus, you will remember that the hippocampus is responsible for memory. And last but not least in the limbic system is the amygdala. And the amygdala is responsible for emotions, specifically emotions like anger and fear. I like to think of the amygdala, of the first three letters being Amy, as an emotional person named Angry Amy. The amygdala then is responsible for fear, aggression, anger, and a variety of other emotions like that. Finally, we get to the top of the brain, and the top of the brain is referred to as the cerebral cortex. So as a whole, the entire top of our brain is responsible for cognitive functioning, thinking, perceiving, planning, and language. The cerebral cortex is held together by a bundle of nerve fibers in the middle called the corpus callosum. And the corpus callosum's responsibility is to send information back and forth from the left hemisphere to the right and vice versa. And that will become important later on as we talk about some localization or specialization to different areas of the brain. In our cerebral cortex, we have four main lobes: the frontal lobe, the occipital lobe, the temporal lobe, and the parietal lobe. The occipital lobe is responsible for vision. It contains a structure known as the visual cortex, which is where we process the information that we see. The temporal lobe, on the side of our head, is responsible for hearing. It contains the structures such as the auditory cortex to help us make sense of the information that we hear. And the parietal lobe is responsible for our sense of touch. It holds things like our somatosensory cortex, which is going to process those touch sensations that come in from our body and up to our brain via the thalamus. And we also have some specific association areas in different parts of our brain. So throughout the cerebral cortex, there are going to be specific specialized areas that are responsible for specific cognitive functions. So as we mentioned, in the parietal lobe, there is the somatosensory cortex, and that is going to be responsible for taking in information such as touch, temperature, and pain, and processing that in the brain. In the frontal lobe, which is responsible for things like problem solving and controlling voluntary muscle movement, decision making, and other higher level or higher order functioning. We also have throughout our brain areas that are responsible for linguistic processing, so understanding language, and areas responsible for higher order thinking, so critical thinking, problem solving, creativity, and so on. And executive functioning, things like creating goals, planning, organizing our behavior, being able to manage impulses, and so on. The prefrontal cortex is an example of one of those association areas as well. It is really where our personality comes from and some of our decision making and social behavior. Also in our frontal lobe is the motor cortex, and that's going to be responsible for voluntary muscle movement. So our decision to move is going to be controlled by that frontal lobe, and the actual movement is going to take place through our motor cortex. As we mentioned before, these two sides of our brain, of our cerebral cortex, are held together through a structure called the corpus callosum. And this is going to help us understand what's known as split brain research. In some cases of a seizure disorder, it's necessary to cut the corpus callosum in order to prevent seizure activity from passing from one side of the brain to the next. As a result, we notice some unique changes that take place in an individual when these two sides of the brain can no longer communicate. This highlights the importance of what's known as hemispheric specialization, and that is the idea that there are specific areas of the brain responsible for different functions that are different in our left hemisphere and in our right. For example, in our left hemisphere, there is a structure known as the Broca's area, and Broca's area is responsible for language, the production of language in particular. So our ability to speak is coming from our Broca's area that's coming from the left side of our brain. The Wernicke's area, which is right next to the Broca's area, is also responsible for language. In this case, it's language comprehension and understanding. So your ability to understand what's happening right now is coming from your Wernicke's area. So the unique thing about split brain research is what we find is that language is produced on the left side of our brain. So when someone no longer has a corpus callosum, information from the right side of the brain can no longer make its way to the left hemisphere in order for a person to be able to verbalize or speak what it is that they are experiencing. There are some unique cases where that takes place that we'll look at closer in class. And of course, Broca's area and Wernicke's area being so important in language, we can also see some unique features when those areas are damaged in some way. That's referred to as aphasia when we have impairment in language, when it either comes from the creation or production of language or in understanding language, depending on which area has been impacted by this aphasia. There's also some really unique features of the brain, such as contralateral hemispheric organization. And what this simply means is that the opposite side of the brain controls the opposite side of the body. So that motor cortex that goes over the entire top of our brain, The left side of our brain is controlling our right arm and leg and so on. And then the other side of the brain is going to control the other side of the body as well. This is important because what happens if some area of the brain is damaged in some way? If you damage a part of your motor cortex, are you going to lose your ability to, say, move an arm or leg the way that you'd want to? Fortunately for us, that's not the case because of a unique feature of the brain called plasticity. And plasticity, or neuroplasticity, is the brain's ability to reorganize and change over time. Just like you can strengthen neural connections through practice and memorization and improve on different skills that you can do, if you were to damage an area of the brain, other areas can start to take over for that functioning to allow you to still be able to do the things that you would like to do. It's not a perfect system, but the younger we are, the more plastic our brain is, and the more likely we are to overcome those different injuries that could take place. And finally, we'll end with, how do we know where all of these different areas are in the brain? Brain scans have been pivotal in helping us to understand what is actually taking place inside of our head. There are a wide variety of different brain scans that are used for different purposes depending on the circumstances. Things like PET scans or MRIs, CT scans can all be useful in different medical settings. The two that we need to know are going to be EEGs and fMRIs. EEGs are brain scans where electrodes are going to be placed all over the head in order to measure brain waves and brain activity. These are very important in sleep, which we'll see in the next section. fMRIs, or functional MRIs, are the most detailed look at the brain. It shows us not only the structure of the brain and the physical makeup, but also the brain activity that's taking place. It's really what allows us to be able to pinpoint exactly what area of the brain is being engaged when someone is engaging in a specific behavior or mental process. And then we can of course see through lesioning or damage to different areas of the brain what will happen when that area of the brain is no longer functioning. So these scans help us to pinpoint that localization in the brain that really started with Phineas over 150 years ago, giving us an even better understanding of what is going on in our minds that makes us who we are. And we're constantly learning more as the science progresses. So thank you so much for watching, and as always remember, be kind to your mind.